Anne is helping us kick off a new author series called the Lindenwood Craft Talks. The idea is to focus on a writer's creative process. As her publisher Orbit notes, Anne is the first author to ever win the Hugo, Nebula, and Arthur C. Clarke Awards all at once for her first novel, Ancillary Justice. I say ancillary, but it's ancillary too. What do you like?
I say ancillary.
Okay.
And many of my British readers say ancillary, and some people, but it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. So I'll go back and forth. She's also published short stories in Subterranean Magazine, Strange Horizons, Realms of Fantasy. She's served as an editor for Podcastle, the fantasy fiction podcast. Anne is no stranger to hard work in her writing and in the world. She has worked as a waitress, I love that, a receptionist, a rodman on a land surveying crew, and a recording engineer. Many of you know, I think many of her fans may be here, but I'm speaking also for those that don't know Anne yet. So part of the uniqueness of the Ancillary series was Anne's fresh approach in marking, or rather not marking, the gender of the characters. In this future empire of tea-drinking colonials, colonies, I will note, that are backed by staggering military might, the personal pronoun is she, her. And I've been sharing with many colleagues and students that it's really fun to watch your own mind kind of bang up against that and kind of watching the power dynamics and the politeness dynamics and trying to figure out what character's what. Her newest novel, Provenance, which I had somewhere, is set in the same universe as her Ancillary trilogy, and it's been described by NPR as a cozy space mystery. Amid a story that tips at times into something like a novel of manners, she includes glimpses of the manners of funky alien cultures with wonderful names like the Gek and the Rrr. Is that right? Or is it the Rrr?
I say the Rrr, but
like
once again.
the pirates, okay. And what is more fun than alien cultures? Well, besides distant future cultures. After all, culture is something we are collectively creating together, rooted in the particularities of our environments. And we swim in it, so we don't see it clearly. And this is where, I will say this for Anne's daughter, science fiction is a consummate means to see outside our worlds and inside of who we are and how we make this all up together, just as much as literary, yeah? Summer is coming, all of you Game of Thrones fans. And so now you know where to get your edifuncation, right? It's fun and edifying. Provenance is outside in the hallway. Margaret Atwood recently said in The Guardian that science fiction is not about the future, but is really about now. And we are eager in the Academy to write papers on post-colonialism and post-humanism, while the world we're all making remains entrenched in neocolonialism, in colonizers' daily attitudes and behaviors, which thwart and distort all that is best in our humanness. Anne's books are set in a colonial future of a militarized empire that spans planets. Now, this may sound like Ursula Le Guin's complaint, who just died, so I wanted to mention Ursula here, about the science fiction of her youth, when she said, "It seems to be all about hardware and soldiers." And seems is the pivotal word here. The Ancillary series is a military space opera filled with hardware and soldiers. And indeed, the trilogy's hero, Breck, is a corpse soldier, a conquered resistor of the empire, whose body is reanimated by artificial intelligence. She's an AI mind jacked into a military ship, sharing a hive consciousness with a troop of other corpse soldiers who are all part of the ship. Whoever she was is erased, her body brutally conscripted to be the war machine. So post-colonial, it's not. But what does Anne do with this AI? She shows us the best of our humanness. Witnessing an act of injustice, moved by love that I don't know that she recognizes, Breck breaks away, sets out on a mission to take down the emperor, and then goes on to rescue and uplift everyone around her. And in this way, Breck tasks us with the question of what it means to be human. In her society, her status is subhuman, non-human, AI. But from the very first chapter of the very first book, we see her consistently protecting others, providing for others, caring for others, often despite her own dislike of the person she's caring for. To this last point, the practice of care, I find myself thinking of philosopher Virginia Held's work on the ethics of care, an ethic in direct conflict with the ethics and outlook of colonialism. Held points out that there's nothing sentimental about care, that care is not an emotional state, but a behavior, an action, and that it is simply logical. It is simply logical that we take care of each other. And what has been especially exciting in the past weeks of arranging this event, all the things, right, has been learning more about the author. Anne embodies the spirit one would hope to see in writers, empathy and generosity, not only in her main character, but in her own life in the writing community. If you look up Ann Leckie online, and I'm sure many of you have already, but there's much about Anne online, and you will see keen intelligence, wonderful humility, humor, discerning quirkiness, and great generosity. Anne's down-to-earth graciousness about her success expresses itself in part as generosity to others. She even gives aspiring authors her query letter for her first book. That's online, you can find it. So I just want to thank you for your generosity in coming to Lindenwood, and please welcome Ann Leckie.
Thank you. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I love talking to folks. I will, should we maybe think of a question and I'll explain about the query letter, because that seems like it's practical. It's maybe not writing craft, but it's writing business. Those of you who are working on novels, almost certainly when you go to look for an agent, you'll need to submit first a query letter, which is about 300 to 500 words long, a single page, in which you have to explain in about 200 to 300 words what your novel is about. Really simple, right? And you need to do it in a way that will grab the agent's attention. We've all worked really hard on writing novels and short stories. We do not know how to write query letters. The way I learned to write a query letter was a website called Query Shark. It's still out there. And she's an agent who will critique people's query letters. They submit them. And so if you go back and read those archives, by the time you are done reading all of the query letters on that site, you will know what a query letter is supposed to look like. And I feel like we learn to write things by reading those things. We think about things in the forms that we read, as I said to some of the students earlier. So the way I think to learn to write a good query letter is to read them, and so that's why I put my query letter out on my website, because it is a query letter that worked, and so it's one more thing for folks to read if they want to learn to write a query letter. So that's a thing. Look for Query Shark if you are at the stage. Even if you're not, just read the query letters, right? Because query letters ought to be illegal, but sadly they are not. Yeah. So does anybody have a particularly burning issue, a question they would really like to ask? Because I am more than happy to answer somebody's question, or I'll pull a thing off of the index cards, or what would people like? Anybody have a question? Yes, you do. Mm-hmm.
A lot of questions. Okay, so when I was reading Ancillary Justice, it is so intricate, and I was just blown away by the intricacy of not just the society, but the religion and the way that people practice and their thoughts and things like that. You said earlier that you don't outline.
I do not outline.
But
No.
I mean, it seems, and earlier you said it was so overwhelming to think about actually writing this novel.
Yeah.
So how much had you
Yes.
written that you refer back to? I mean, how long did it take you to come up with
I'm
this?
sorry, Gina.
Oh, that's okay.
She's kind of...
Which one do you want me to use?
So the question was that my world building and that the book seemed very intricate, and I had said earlier back in the other room that I don't generally outline, and so how do I do that, right, is what you're... So mostly I'm very world building heavy, right, and I do a lot of research, and in fact there's a card here on research, so maybe I'll go off on that tangent. But my research is usually not directed at first. I just read random stuff. Right, being a writer is one of the best occupations because it means no matter what you read, you are working. It's important. Sitting on the couch eating peanut butter and jelly reading a comic book, you are working. It's important, right? Anything you read is material. So I tend to be drawn to history and anthropology. And of course, we're blessed here in the St. Louis area to have lots of fabulous college and university libraries. And so I'll just walk into a library and walk down the anthropology shelves. Oh, that's an interesting title. Oh, that's an interesting title, right? And then anything that's shiny, I just throw into the box. Here's the box of my project. Ooh, that's shiny. Throw it in there. And so that's kind of how all those details end up there. But I also spend a lot of thinking time putting those shiny pieces together because they don't always fit, or they don't always fit the way they seem to at first. It's a side point, but I think this is really important, particularly in science fiction and fantasy, which is a very commercial genre, which I don't generally have a problem with, but there's a lot of focus on output, on getting your words every day, writing 1,000 words every day, writing 2,000 words every day. And you do need to get words out, but sometimes the work isn't writing. Sometimes the work is sitting on the front porch daydreaming, right? Much of the plot for Ancillary Justice and the world were assembled like in those times, standing in line at the post office when you're bored and you're telling yourself little stories. That's where you do that work. But that work is important, and it's not something anyone else can see, so often you feel like it's not work. But basically, I just throw everything into the box. The thing that frightened me about Ancillary Justice was the point of view character, right? Because she's a hard character to write from. And ultimately, I actually kind of find it kind of funny that you talked about it as intricate, because I experienced it as, it's too complicated a problem for me, so I'm just going to do it very straightforward. I'm just going to do one step, and then the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step, and think about what the next step is. And I just did it one step at a time instead of, so I felt like I was faced with an intractable, complicated problem, and I just broke it down and did it very straightforwardly, right? But that doesn't always show. Research, though, the thing about research can also unblock you. So doing research is super important. In science fiction in particular, if you've got your spaceships, you want to make a choice whether you want to pay attention to physics or not, for instance. And then you need to figure out the answers. But if you find that you're researching for years into little details and never writing, you need to stop researching, right? Research is really super important, but if it is keeping you from writing for if you go a year and don't put a word down and you're still looking what kind of pan somebody used in 1953, you need to stop, because you can look that up as you write. Yeah. Another question? Yes, I see a hand back there. We'll
try. Here. You have to use both, sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
It's like a news station.
So I'm in the middle of the series, and I'm definitely still actively thinking about it, and I know for sure that I'm not interpreting everything that I'm reading correctly. So, and this question's a bit broad. So with all that being said, how do you think about race in your work? Because I noticed that a lot of your ancillaries and I hope this is right, but the oppressor of the series, and it's much more complicated than that, I'm sure, but the oppressor of the series is, you often say, dark-skinned. So I was really interested in that. I do want to high five you and give you a hug for how you talk about race, but I just want to make sure I have an understanding of it while I'm reading it. So how do you think about it? How do you conceptualize it? How do you put that in your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And of course, race is a very fraught question. And the ways that writers deal with it, particularly white writers, right, can be a little bit problematic, as the kids say. I began very naively thinking, you look at the especially popular military space opera stuff, and boy, that future looks awfully white. And really, is that only white people are going to space? I don't think so. And then I think to myself very naively, well, it would be cool if not only did we have people of various ethnic backgrounds and various skin colors make it into space, but instead of this assumption that pale, fair, blonde folks are the beautiful ones, what if I flip that around? Now, that's super dangerous, of course. Maybe N.K. Jemisin, who calls that a discrimiflip, and can often not undermine racist assumptions, but can end up underlining them and supporting them, which was a thing I realized partway through my project. But I also didn't want to let go of that And I had already sort of complicated, I began thinking, wouldn't it, for instance, with the pronouns, wouldn't it be cool if I had a society that just didn't care about gender? And then I said, what if I just use she? Well, that has the effect of making what looks like a matriarchal oppressive society, which is another common discrimiflip. And I said, well, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to have to be super careful about how I do that and not make it and what if the black people oppressed the white people kind of thing, right? Because that's, I mean, really? Yeah. And so I was not trying to do that at all. I was trying to hold on to the idea that what if our standards of beauty are not biological standards of beauty, as many people assume they are, but a question of what cultural assumptions are about who's in power, right? And that's what I was trying to do.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Other questions? I'll start through the... No? So someone already asked me, since this is sitting right here, if I knew the ancillary series was going to be a trilogy, or did it sort of happen while I was writing? It's one of my cards.
Yeah.
In fact, I did know, but I had no idea what the second and third books were going to be about. As I said, we know what forms to write in because we read those forms. I had grown up reading science fiction trilogies. So I had a big epic plot. Well, of course, it must be a trilogy, right? I actually did not know. I knew where I was going to end it, but I didn't know how I was going to do it until like the chapter before, like the page before the last chapter, when I went, oh, that's how I'm going to do it. I also try to think about the definite craft things. These questions are. Oh, here's this question about research. Let's see. I said already that I don't outline. I want to say up front that writing is a very individual kind of thing. I kind of feel like we have to hack into our subconscious to write because writing is very complicated. It's way more complicated, I think, than most of us can do with holding everything conscious. And so we almost have to figure out the ways that works for us to trick our subconscious into coughing up the material that we need. And so it's always going to be different. If some writer tells you you have to outline everything, no. What they're saying is I outline everything. You might want to try it. And if it works for you, it does not work for me. How do you even know what to put in the outline if you haven't written the scene yet? I don't understand. But if it works for you, then do. I tend to, when I wrote Ancillary Justice, I had almost no organizational materials, none whatsoever. I did have a piece of paper taped to my office wall with the number of palace stations, so sort of provincial capitals, and approximately how long it ought to take to travel light speed between them, because I needed to know how long it would take a thought to reach from one end of Anandra to the other end of Anandra. That was a plot relevant thing. That was it. So then I began to write the second book, and I was in serious trouble because I realized that I didn't know who was on what space station or what spaceship where or when, and I needed to get that. And I tried Post-its on the wall, and that was insufficient. And so I discovered there is, and you might want to play with this, it makes an excellent cat vacuuming toy, and I'll explain cat vacuuming in a minute, TiddlyWiki. It's a little personal wiki that you keep on your desktop or in your Dropbox or whatever, and you can read it through your browser, and it works like Wikipedia, right? And you edit it, and if you keep it on your desktop, nobody else can see it. You can customize it and make it all pretty and waste a lot of time that way. I spent a month or two after beginning Ancillary Sword just filling out things in my TiddlyWiki. If that's a thing that works for you, then do. Cat vacuuming. Y'all know this, I'm sure, because y'all are writers here. You sit down to write, and all of a sudden you go, oh, the bathtub is really dirty. I have got to scrub that bathtub now, right? The cat has not been vacuumed for months. I have got to vacuum that cat. That's cat vacuuming. The stuff that you do to avoid writing, right? Sometimes it's useful. Sometimes scrubbing the bathtub gets you into a zone in your head because you're not doing any. Don't listen to a podcast while you do it, or this won't work. Get into a zone where the back of your mind is working, and all of a sudden you go, oh. Some people do that while they're driving. Showers work for that, right? If you're stuck, get up and take a shower. Yeah? If driving works for you, be careful. C.J. Cherry, who I don't know if y'all are familiar with her work, her wife has told her she is forbidden to drive while she is plotting a novel because on one occasion she made a left turn into oncoming traffic. Nothing. Everybody was okay, but she said, all I saw was a hillside and sheep. Yeah. So all those things will work. So the Tiddlywiki can be a cat vacuuming activity, and you can make it very pretty, and it can help you organize things and link everything up. The novel that I'm just finishing revisions on right now, I put a poster board on the wall and just wrote notes on the poster board, right? And then I can fold it up and get rid of it when it's done. Anything that works. Some people like file cards. Some people use spreadsheets. I don't know how that would work, but I know people who use them. Some people just have a big, long Word document full of stuff. I don't know how they find things. Anything that works. Uh-huh.
So once you initially finished, but when you were about to query, how many edits after that, or how many edits before you queried or before you submitted? And then how many edits once you got with Orbit?
Okay, so the number of edits has become complicated because by the time I wrote Ancillary Justice, I was no longer writing a whole piece and then going back and rewriting it. Right? I did that when I started out. I was not doing that anymore by the time I turned that novel in. But I spent a long time with it. It took me a long time just to finish a first draft, and then I spent a couple of years revising that first draft. I also had a day job. I was working as a lunch lady at the time. I had kids. Those things will suck up your time. I was talking with some friends on Twitter. Stephen King in On Writing says this thing, you have to write every single day and read every single afternoon and don't worry about anything else or else you... Stephen King had a wife who did all that other stuff for him. All the great writers, he wrote, and just, food appeared. Yeah, they had servants. So for the rest of us, it might take us a little longer, right? But I don't know how many drafts, but I spent a long time with it. I also had friends who, by that point, who were there to look at it and say, okay, I think it's ready to go, right? That's one of the many things that good friends will help you for. Some of it is just holding your hand and saying, yes, I know they're fools. They don't recognize your brilliance. The rejection letter, they'll learn. They'll be sorry one day. That's what your friends do for you, right? They also help tell you, no, it's time for you to send that out, right? So I don't know how many times. Then I queried, which was a terrifying process. I got my agent, and he then wanted edits, and I had to do 2 rounds of edits for my agent before he was ready to send it out. And then my editor gave me a round of edits. I should say my editors, because I have a British editor and an American editor. And they give me edits at the same time. It's the same company and different. And I did edits for them. And I may or may not have ever had to do more, but then that editor promptly quit to write his own Edgar-winning mystery novel. And I was like, you're not supposed to make decisions for your career, right? But usually I only have 1 round of edits. I'll often have a phone call with my editor, and he'll talk about the things that aren't working or whatever, and then I'll get my edit letter, which is very painful. I poke it with a stick for a couple of days, and then I read the whole thing, and I'm like, oh, it's not that bad. It didn't bite me, right? And then spend a long time banging my head on the keyboard to fix whatever I agree with. I said back in the other room for y'all, don't be afraid of editors. They're human beings, and they actually, with some exceptions, they don't get to order you to do things. They give you suggestions that they hope are helpful. Right? Now, sometimes if you're working for a book packager and you don't even really get your name on the thing, you don't get to argue with the editor. But normally, don't be afraid to tell the editor, no, I'm keeping that, right? But I've only ever done 1 round of edits with the publisher. Yeah.
The time between novels decreased over time?
So God, yes.
What was it that you feel, in your opinion, made everything easier? Because between Mercy,
I think there's a misapprehension in that question. So first of all, I've heard it said, and I think it's true, is that what you learn when you write a book is you learn how to write that book. You don't learn how to write the next book. You learn some things, but they aren't the things you need to know for the next book. When I sold Ancillary Justice, the publisher, which is sort of the person in charge of the publisher, it sounds kind of funny, said to me, how long do you want between novels? And I said, oh, a year. That's a nice long time, a year to write the next book. Oh, no. I was a few months late with it, actually. And then I was a few months late with the third one. And when it came time for the next contract, I said to my agent, I want 2 years for the next book. I wish I'd asked for 3. So it didn't get easier, but there is nothing quite as motivating as that deadline, right? But that was why I said back in the other room, enjoy your luxury of not having a deadline. It doesn't seem like a luxury, but it is, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. So how do you stay dedicated and persevere with your characters? I once had heard an author say, in the middle of your book, everyone hates their main character because you've been stuck with them for so long. And I find that with my own characters, no matter how much I love them at the beginning, like halfway through, I'm like, oh, I'm still writing about this person. But it's like almost you need to like get past that. Did you have that sense? Do you have that, or how do you stay dedicated to it?
I had something like that, but it wasn't aimed at the character necessarily. Although I will say that when I finished the trilogy, I was ready to write about someone other than Breck, right? But there is a thing that happens around about the middle where you just feel like it's endless. Like, why did I even get into this? For me, actually, it happens about 3/4 of the way through. And for me, it manifests as a kind of panic. Where I suddenly feel like, why did I even think I should write this novel? It's not a good idea. The whole thing isn't working. It's just, that's sort of a constant, that little voice, that inner critic is always talking, right? But there's a moment where it becomes really intense, and I'm very tempted to just give it all up. And it's almost always about 3/4 of the way through. And I have in the past just kind of went, no, I didn't get as far as I've gotten, which wasn't very far at the beginning, but still, I haven't gotten this far by giving up, right? And it's true. The published are the persistent. Don't forget that, right? But I'm just going to have to soldier on through it, and I always did. And at one point, I was reading Neil Gaiman's blog. You all know who Neil Gaiman is, right? And he was telling a story about when he was writing, I think it was Anansi Boys. And he called up his agent and he said, this is terrible. I'm really, really sorry, but we're going to have to give back the advance. This was just not a good idea. And I don't know why I thought it was. We're just going to have to apologize to the publisher because there's just no way. And his agent began laughing at him. And he said, this is not funny. Why are you laughing? And she said, Neil, you do this every single time. Hang up the phone and finish the book. And I said, well, if Neil Gaiman does it, then it's okay for me to do it, right? I just know it's that moment. But I think everybody, there's something about the middle of the work, right? You've gone so far through and you still aren't quite seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and it feels like you can't do it. But you can. Right. And I don't have any better advice than to say grit your teeth and tough it out, but that's also not going to be suitable advice for everybody. Some people may need to take a week and eat ice cream and have their friends tell them they're wonderful. But that's what our friends are for, right? You do that for your friends and your friends do that for you because you need that, right? Writing can be very demoralizing. And I wish I had better advice for that moment, but it's a really horrible moment, isn't it? Yeah.
They're right next to me. Can I just ask another one? Thank you.
Okay, so my thesis is a murder mystery,
Ooh.
and it's the first one that I've ever written. So your advice about plotting and organizing and researching is really helpful. But what I guess is the hardest thing for me right now when I'm doing drafts is trying to get my character to kill somebody.
Oh,
You know what I mean?
yeah, that... You kind of have to be in the right mood.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to build up to it right? You have to let the character do the right things in the chapters before that make it feel right that the character is going to, and maybe you have to feel like the character that's going to die really needs to die. There are several ways to, I mean, you don't have to necessarily hate them. And sometimes as a writer, you can, I should say, one can take a perverse pleasure in, you know, inflicting grievous bodily harm on your characters. I remember one, this was back in a workshop, a residential workshop in Seattle, Clarion West, and we were supposed to turn in a short story a week, and I had been working really hard to get this character's arm cut off. I needed it to happen. I had envisioned it when I started the story, and I was trying to make it happen. And finally, one morning, I got up very early before breakfast, and I'm up there in the room, and I wrote. It was all this almost physical relief when his arm got chopped off finally. And I went down to breakfast, and I was in a really good mood. And one of my classmates says, "Wow, Anne, you're in a really good mood." And I said, "I just dismembered my main character." And they said, "Oh, great," because they totally understood. But you do have to like move things around so that it feels right. Yeah, there might be something you need to change, something that makes that logic inexorable, right? And it's also important not to be. We love our characters because we made them, and we want to be protective of them. But if we're too protective of them, nothing will happen, right? It'll be a story about everybody having tea and cookies, which has its own kind of delight, but is not going to be a murder mystery. Yeah. So there might be something you want to shift in the preceding chapters, something about that person or something about what someone is doing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. There's a hand.
Even though you're kind of a pit stop there. All right, here you go. Okay, in both, yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, hi.
Hi.
I have a couple of questions. One is, how old were your children when you started writing?
Oh, they were pretty small, actually. In fact, I began writing, I had been writing on and off since I was very young. But I hit college, and I became convinced that I couldn't write, I wasn't talented. There was no internet for other writers to talk about what they were going through. And I felt like if it wasn't, coming out inspired, that meant that I wasn't really talented, right? And my ideas weren't very good, and all my energy was going to classes. I was about 30 when I had my first child. I'm going to embarrass my daughter now, who's sitting here. My children were the most adorable babies and toddlers. In the history of adorable babies and toddlers, I will fight you. However, I was home with them. I had discovered very quickly that I did not make enough to pay for childcare. And I discovered very quickly that they were not terribly intellectually stimulating company. And I began to feel like my brains were leaking out my ears. And that was when some online friends, thank God for the internet at that point, some online friends said, "Oh, there's this thing called NaNoWriMo." And that was when I began to really write. When I was writing my first NaNoWriMo novel, my daughter, I believe, she was going to school all day, and my son was still a toddler. And so what I did was, my husband was working nights, and so at nap time, I would pop my son into bed next to his father, and I would go down the street to Starbucks and write for 2 hours and come back. Distressingly quickly, I began to come home and find my 2-year-old son in the living room, playing, totally unsupervised, while his father slept peacefully in the bedroom. And that was when I said, "It's time for you to go to the little church daycare down the street for 3 hours every morning." And then I would drop him off at the little daycare and go and write for a few hours. So my daughter will have been, maybe first grade, and my son was a toddler. It's the only, as you'll notice from that story, the only time I could write was when my daughter was in school and my son was asleep, right? Because it wasn't going to happen otherwise. Yeah. So I only had a few hours a day.
And you already mentioned that you you did writing at Starbucks. Where were your other, writing sanctuaries?
Oh, and which was important because at Starbucks and at the Webster University Library was another spot. There was no laundry to be folded. There were no dusty baseboards. There was no microwave that needed cleaning. There was all these other things. And at the time, their Wi-Fi wasn't as big of a thing. If you wanted the internet at the library, you had to get a cable, right? So there was no live journal to distract me. Boy, that really dates me, doesn't it? All these things, so I could take a notebook or the laptop to the Webster University Library and sit down at a carrel and just, start working, not be distracted. Spaces like that are super important. So libraries, I am here for libraries. Libraries are absolutely a public good, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
There we go.
Hello.
Hi.
To add on to what she was saying about not being able to kill off her character, like, I'm not a writer, but sitting here is very interesting. So, like, when you're at that block to not know how to kill off somebody or do any type of gruesome act, like, is that like when you decide to like watch the first 48, Snapped, stuff like that? Or does that hinder what you're trying to do in your book because the story that was on TV kind of like moves you in a different direction?
It can go either way. There is absolutely nothing wrong with stealing from any other story that will give you the material you need. You file off the serial numbers and you make it yours. Right? But it's totally permissible. It is absolutely, don't copy and paste the text. But if you want, and you can even call it an homage if you want to, right? I'm saluting my hero author. So there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes that's what you need to do is go and read a whole bunch of murders, right? And you go, oh, I like that one. I'll use that. Can I put that in? So sometimes that is exactly what you need to do, right?
Outside of like taking a shower, driving, things like that, just sit down and watch.
So read a book that seems like, read some murder mysteries. Or if you know, and I have done this before, if you know specifically the kind of death that you want, or the kind of grievous injury that you want, right? Grievous injuries in particular, you can get first-person accounts of grievous injuries. So go look for somebody who had their arm cut off and read what they had to say about it, right? And then you've got the details that maybe make it solid, because it's also possible that one could have trouble writing it because you're not seeing it. I have to see it, I'll put it that way. And so having those details makes it more real, and you go, oh, I can write a sentence about the way the blade goes through the muscle and I don't want to gross anybody out. So that might help as well, right? Read anything and everything.
So it won't like move you in a different direction from where you was actually trying to go?
It might.
Okay.
But you get to decide whether you want to go in that direction or not, because there's no rule about that you have to go into a particular direction, or that once you've made a decision you have to stay there. It just needs to be what you want it to be. You can totally change your mind if you want, because it's your thing.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Student, yes, okay, no. And other people too?
I think I'm about as old as you are, I guess, but I could date myself. The question is, you said that you read, I guess, different authors. Like, as you were growing up and writing when you were young, what were the, authors that basically piqued your interest and basically drove you to start writing?
So my history with writing is a little bit odd. I'll tell you right off that one of the biggest influences on me and one of the authors who I loved the most when I was a kid was Andre Norton. She wrote so much stuff, and some of it is just dreadful. But she wrote literally hundreds of books. And I suspect you have to kind of come to her when you're like 12 or 13. And she's also kind of old-fashioned by now, right? I was in an odd situation because for some reason that I do not fully understand, my parents were convinced that I was going to be a writer. And I know that's very unusual. I didn't realize how unusual it was until I actually got on the NaNoWriMo message boards and realized that that's just not common. And so my parents would constantly talk to me about stories. They were scientists, they were biochemists, but they were convinced that I was going to be a writer. And my mother told me how to format a manuscript before I was 10 years old, right? So I had always assumed when I was small that I was going to be a writer. And I wrote little things to amuse my classmates in high school. So I felt like a complete failure in college, that I had not lived up to that thing that I was supposed to have done, that I had disappointed my parents, and I was going to be working as a busgirl at Uncle Bill's for the rest of my life, right? Because your music degree, I was going to be a busgirl at Uncle Bill's for the rest of my life. That turned out not to be true. So that was it wasn't necessarily writers. So my experience with writers was a little bit different. It wasn't that a writer pulled me on to be a writer, but that I was already expected to be a writer. And so I was interacting with those as, gosh, wouldn't it be great if I could be one of these people like supposedly I'm supposed to be, right? Yeah. Andre Norton, awesome stuff. So I don't know are any of you here who have read more of the trilogy than the first chapter or two? There's one person. Okay, there's some characters who somebody asked me, did they possibly come out of, and I was like, oh, maybe Lloyd Alexander. The book of the Prydain Chronicles were a huge, Madeleine L'Engle, a big, I never read A Newbery Winner I didn't like. And plenty more stuff. John Christopher, a British science fiction writer. I hit the library and just read everything on the science fiction shelf, much of which I don't remember anymore. Yeah. But I think Andre Norton is way more influential than people realize, because I think way more people read her, but she doesn't get mentioned when people are talking about the history of science fiction. But so many people read her, so much of her work growing up. Mm-hmm.
I guess this is considered a space opera. I mean, do you know why you wanted to write space opera in particular?
Because who doesn't love spaceships, right? I've been a science fiction fan since I was little. I occasionally tried to write quote-unquote realistic fiction, and I usually get bored very quickly. There's fabulous realistic fiction, and I've read it and really enjoyed it a lot. But writing it, for some reason, I always want to throw in the aliens and so.
Conceptually, I was reading an author, Jean Johnson, and she was writing something similar with, I guess, the female protagonist and having her, I guess, wanting to save people as a so-called psychic predictor of the so-called, she was supposed to be the protector, a seer, seeing into the future, and that's her bent was she wanted to protect a lot of people, but actually I didn't see the end of the story until the very end. I was pretty sad by it. So
that's always, endings are hard. Endings are hard to do, and sometimes you don't know what a reader's going to take away from your work. If the ending doesn't go where a reader expected, then the reader can be very thrown off, or be like, wait, that's not what I thought the book was about, right? But it's very difficult you can't control what every reader is going to take from your book. There are reading experiences that are closer to what you intended, but everybody has their own reading experience, and you can't say, your reading experience was wrong, right? Because it was their experience of the book. But sometimes that's going to happen, right? She may have had a different idea. I haven't read the books, but and sometimes the writer just wants to go for the break in your heart, right? And maybe sometimes that's not what you want, right? Like, that's not what I want. I want everybody to live happily ever after. Yeah.
Earlier you spoke of the luxury for new writers of not having a deadline. So one other luxury that I have is that nobody cares right now what I'm writing. But
that's a luxury. You laugh, but it is a luxury. Enjoy it.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so with that, after you were able to publish your first novel and have that success, you have fans. And so kind of piggybacking on what you were speaking just a moment ago, when you read what fans say about your work, and also what they want out of your next story, do you take any of that into account, or you say, this is my story and enjoy it or don't? That's your experience.
I have done both. I have seen readers say, oh, it really has to be such and such, or it must be such and such, it's got to be, and I'm like, nope. And then I've seen readers say a thing, and I'll think to myself, I never thought of that. I never thought of that, and I need to think about that, right? And there are some things in Ancillary Sword 1 or 2, which is the second book, that are explicitly said on the page because I had seen some conversations in other places. And I said, first of all, that's a thing that I was only half thinking about. And secondly, I know there are people who really need to have this thing on the page, right? And it will work, and it doesn't violate what I'm doing with the story. I have not yet come to a situation where I see, oh, I really shipped these two characters and that wasn't my plan. And I'm like, well, I better change the plot to make these two get together, right? I haven't done that. And I don't think that I would. But little things like, oh, there's this thing that, I need to see, or this little logic thing that, and I'm like, you have a point, and I didn't think about that, and now I'm thinking about it. That has definitely happened, yeah. Ultimately, you get to make the choice, yeah. And I know it doesn't feel like a luxury. I know you're sitting there going, I wish everybody could read my book, and nobody cares that I'm writing, and I'm sitting here and I may be doing it for no reason. But trust me, having everybody say, oh, how can the next book possibly be as good as the first one? I can't wait to see what happens. When is it going to come out? I think this is going to happen. I think that is its own kind of stress, and you do not have that right now. Yeah.
Piggybacking on that question, when Ancillary Justice won the Hugo, and the backlash from traditional science
from
fiction
the puppies.
and the puppies and
Bless their heart.
just the whole thing that spiraled out of control. At any point before or when you were writing Ancillary Mercy or going forward, did it make you pause or stop, or was it fuel? Like, what were you feeling during that time? Because I've seen other people weigh in, but I didn't see you weigh in much.
I mostly haven't weighed in, partly because a number of other people have weighed in and said things, and also partly because in some respects I refuse to dignify them with a reply. I do have very firm opinions about what went on and what that was all about. In fact, in some respects, it was not, for my work, it was not totally unexpected. When I decided to use the pronoun she for all the characters in the book, I was saying back in the room, I had a friend of mine, a professional writer, say, nobody will buy this, right? Everyone knows that science fiction is a boys' club, right? And this makes it girly, and it's awesome, but nobody's going to buy it. And I'm like, well, fork that. I'm going to do it anyway. And but I was expecting, and I had a conversation with a friend of mine who was like, oh, you're going to have people complaining that they, how do I say this politely, that there aren't enough of the right sort of genitalia that they can see in that book. And I said, ha, 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 I'll give them a pile of them in the second book. And I actually did. And that was a little private joke, but that was actually before all that stuff. So then when the second book came out and all this stuff was going on with the puppies, there was that pile of appropriate genitalia in the second book, and it was I got kind of a kick out of that. So I was already expecting some pushback. I wasn't expecting that particular pushback. But that was a symptom of a number of larger things and didn't necessarily have anything specific to do with my work, if that makes sense. In fact, my friend Rachel Swirsky, whose short fiction is amazing, got much more trouble, partly because her Hugo-nominated story was like 500 words long and you could read it in 5 minutes. If you were a dinosaur, my love, yeah, almost more of a poem than a story, yeah. But it was notable that most of the puppies didn't spend a whole lot of time specifically critiquing my work because most of them hadn't taken the time to read it. right? Yeah. But yeah, that was a super interesting experience, and I'm glad to say I don't think there's any. I mean, they're still yapping, but they're not mucking up the Hugo ballot this year. Yeah, I think they're. Yeah, and I should probably bite my tongue on anything else I would say about that.
Hi. Yeah, so I don't have a whole lot of experience in writing, but the little bit of writing that I've done, I find that my main character, my protagonist, a lot of me gets put into that and or alter ego of me. And I've kind of struggled with, should I be guarding against that? You know, at what point does this become transparent to a reader where they're like, gee, this guy, is this a therapy session or what? You know, so I'm just kind of curious, is that something that you keep at arm's length, or is it just something that's inevitable that's going to happen?
It's both. It is inevitable it's going to happen. Your own psychological stuff is going to end up on the page, even if you work very hard to keep it off. It's going to be there. That's part of why it's so terrifying to write, right? Because you can see it, usually. Sometimes you can't, but you know it's there. You feel very naked, right? When you're even when you're writing, Jane Doe kills the aliens story. There's still something about you that's ending up on the page, right? And that's very scary. My approach is often, it's hard not to have the wish fulfillment stuff come as soon as I imagine a character or a story, is to then look and say, well, what's wish fulfillment here? And what can I turn around or shift in a way that it's not just coming raw onto the page? I'm not just like vomiting my id out onto, for the whole world to see. And what can I kind of change around? What can I take out or edit? But there's no completely avoiding it. You yourself will be in there. People don't always see it. You feel like everybody can see that is, your big fear out there on the page. Readers, by and large, won't see it. They'll make bizarre guesses about things that actually are your psychological hang-ups, and you're like, really? Very few will be the readers who will pinpoint exactly.
And just did you ever have any fears about those closest to you seeing that, and then maybe that your family's going to read your writings, and maybe they'll read something into what you wrote that might dig up some sort of
Mostly
feud in the
not.
past or something?
Mostly not. I haven't yet written anything like that. I have to say, on the one hand, I regret that my parents weren't alive when my first book came out. On the other hand, I know that they were the kind of readers who would go through a book and say, oh, this is because this writer thinks this. And I know they would have been looking through my book going, oh, yep, I knew that about Anne, right? In some ways, I'm kind of glad that I didn't have to sit through that. In other ways, I'm very sorry, because I think they would have been really proud, even though they didn't think much of science fiction and they wanted me to write mysteries. But yeah, I've been fortunate. Maybe I've been avoiding those things in self-defense. It wouldn't surprise me if I had been. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Hey, Anne. So I was thinking to myself, if I was going to make a movie, I would want to have John Williams score the film.
Oh, wouldn't that be awesome?
If you are making a sci-fi book, having John Harris do the illustrations for the book, and the art is, he's pretty iconic. There's so many big authors. Did you get to weigh in on any of that decision for that? And did you get to meet him? What do you think about his work? Anything? I
met him very briefly at the Hugos in London. And he congratulated me for winning, and I said it was because it had such a beautiful cover, right? He's a very nice guy. And in theory, I got to weigh in on the cover, but it was first I had that conversation with the publisher about how long between books, and then he said, well, do you have thoughts about the cover? And I'm like, I thought that was y'all's job. Right? I was not prepared to. I said, I just want a science fiction cover. I want an awesome cover. I don't know. And so at one point I got an email saying, here's our idea. It's going to be 3 books. We're going to cut this painting in 3. What do you think? And I'm like, it's awesome, right? I don't know what would have happened if I'd have said, no, I hate it. That might have been the time for a knockdown drag out. When that happens, you have your agent talk to them. You don't have when it gets to be a big argument, you go to your agent and you have your agent have the big argument with your editor, just so you know. That's what your agent does for you, among other things. I haven't had to do that with a cover, but I've had awesome covers, right? Well, I've had all John Harris covers so far, right? I don't know what would happen if I kicked up a fuss about the cover, to be honest. But really, in the end, that's a thing that marketing and the art department do. And my attitude has always been, you guys know what you're doing. This is not my expertise. I'll let you guys do. But if it was something horrible, something really awful, I would be prepared to call in my agent and have a knockdown drag out.
Are you inspired by his work at all when you look at it?
It's awesome. It is beautiful. Yeah, I love his work a lot. In fact, the original painting went up for sale, and I looked at it and I said, ooh, maybe I can buy it. And it was thousands and thousands of dollars. And I had a little sad. And a friend of mine said, Ann, artists sell prints of their work. So I actually have a full-size print of the whole trilogy. It's all one painting hanging up, which is super awesome. But yeah, I've been super lucky with my covers. Yeah.
I just have a quick little fun question. I really like robots and androids and computers that are surrounded by humans, and namely like Data from Star Trek and Hal from 2001. So are there any characters like that inspired you to write Bragg?
Oh, I would say Hal from 2001 and probably Data from Star Trek. When I was very small, let me think now, I have to think of the year. I was about 4. And 2001 was coming around for a special engagement. It had been out for a year or two, and at the time, the only way you could see a movie was if it was in the theater, right? And the adult who was responsible for me that weekend wanted to go see 2001 and did not have anyone to look after me. So they took 4-year-old me to the theater to see 2001. That must have scarred me for life. But the thing is, I really loved it. And there's no forgetting Hal singing A Bicycle Built for Two, right? You just don't forget that. Hal's a really amazing character. Hal's the best. I get really incensed when people talk about Hal as the villain of 2001. I'm like, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. He was a victim. Yeah, right? Yeah. He was a great character. So, no, I love Hal in 2001. And when Star Trek Next Generation came out, I had watched Star Trek when I was tiny. Star Trek came out the year that I was born, actually, so I saw it on reruns, on TV. And then Next Generation came out, and I'm like, yay! Data was the best character. I mean, let's be honest, right? Although they handled him really weirdly, and the whole thing about the emotion chip, and I'll go into a rant because that was just, what do you mean Data has no emotions and needs an emotion chip? You're wrong. Right? So I think those would be big ones, but I'm with you. There's something really interesting about AIs and robots and androids, and I'm not sure what it is exactly. There's something really interesting, yeah. Something really appealing.
Sorry to hear you say that, because I've been trying to figure that out.
I honestly don't know what it is. And not everybody, other people are like, they can take or leave robots. And I don't know what's wrong with them. I guess we need all kinds of people in the world, right? But yeah, I don't know what it is. I honestly don't.
I just had one question. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to say I was really stoked to hear you talk about Lloyd Alexander, because I have a copy of that in my bag. It's falling apart, but
oh, they're so wonderful.
I read it so many times that it's just completely falling to pieces, but I can't find another copy yet, so.
Oh, tell me it's not out of print.
No, I just haven't bothered to look online to find one.
All right.
That would require work. But my question was, how do you feel about having your character ending your story with a tragic ending where the main character or characters all die? Where they complete they get to the final challenge and confront the final challenge, and yep, there's the final challenge, all dead.
So it depends, because there's different ways.
Fail.
Do they fail and all die? Do they succeed and all die? There's all kinds of ways to have. There's all kinds of ways to have a tragedy. I've written short stories with more or less tragic endings. Sometimes it's the ending that's called for, right? But I have to admit, being a science fiction and fantasy writer, my impulse is not towards tragic endings, because that's not the standard ending. Like the standard ending for a romance, a good romance, which is a good romance is a lovely thing. The ending you expect out of the romance, no matter what the suspense is, you expect that happily ever after at the end. That's part of what makes it a romance form, right? And to a certain extent, the kind of adventure fiction that science fiction and fantasy sort of descends from expects a kind of triumphant ending, at least for the hero. But they don't all end that way. But the pull is very strong that way, right? But I figure the ending needs to be what the ending needs to be, even if it's not the ending that the genre or the audience expectations expect. You might have to do some jimmying to make it so that it's the ending that's inevitable, so that your reader doesn't feel cheated at the end. But inevitably, some readers will feel cheated, and that's okay. You just can't control that. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, folks, so a couple more questions after this. I'll bring it down to you in one moment, okay?
Hello.
Hello.
What would be your suggestion on maintaining the same voice or same emotion throughout a longer piece? Like, I read your life on website. Like, it was saying that like you were at home for quite sometimes around 6 months, taking care of your kids while you started writing your novel. So I'm not complaining. Where's Gillian? Where students were being like assigned with different workshops and assignments, and then each time the emotion changes, the sound changes. So maintaining the same voice, the same emotion in the longer pieces is becoming really hard. At least for me, this is what I'm fighting with. So how do you do that? What would be your suggestion on maintaining the same thing?
You're absolutely right. It's one thing to maintain a voice for a short piece. To maintain the voice for a long time is like, it's like, I have the degree in music. I think of it kind of like singing, right? Singing through a whole opera is really strenuous. Singing one song isn't, right? To a certain extent, there's just a headspace I try and get into. And as I was saying in there that people were asking about my process and about editing, what I'll often do is I'll write for the day. The next day when I come back, I sit down and I go back over what I wrote the day before and kind of adjust it. But that's kind of a way into the flow from the day before, if that makes sense. So I don't just start cold and start typing. I go back and look at what I did and read and kind of take a running start up at the day's work, and that's part of it. Sometimes I will have a soundtrack. Sometimes I have particular pieces of music that I just play over and over and over again while I'm working on a particular piece. Sometimes I have to find what that is, but that's almost a sort of subconscious trigger to get me in that particular state of mind. It can be weird. At one point I was using the Pacific Rim soundtrack because it's really cool. Monsters and robots, it's the best thing. And it was working really well for the piece. And then I went to rewatch the movie, and it was very strange because I was getting cues from the thing I was working on and not from the movie, and it was very weird. But music in particular can have a lot of moods kind of subconsciously attached to it, and you can manipulate that if you want. But so I would spend time going back over what you've done each day. I would try and keep the character's voice in your head as much as possible, and maybe play with using some music or some other cues. Some people like to light candles or burn incense when they write. It brings on a particular state of mind. Just use it's very visceral. Use whatever kinds of cues you can so that on the day when you're in it, you can go back and take those cues again, and they'll maybe help bring that back another time.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your reference to Andre Norton, who was one of my favorites growing up and still remains to be one of my favorites. As I read your book, I had an immediate resonance, though, to Le Guin's work, particularly The Left Hand of Darkness. Was there any connection to that for you at all? Again, sort of that gender-bending kind of turning all those kinds of expectations inside out?
So I get that question a fair amount, as you can imagine. And of course, The Left Hand of Darkness is very famous. So I knew for those of you who haven't read it, you really ought to remedy that as quickly as you can. It's an amazing book. But she wrote about a race of humans who had no gender except once a month when they were in Kemmer and might manifest either as masculine or feminine, and so could be mothers or fathers of children. But she chose to refer to everyone as he. Now, she was writing in the 60s, and that seemed like the best available choice. And I knew that she had been later dissatisfied with that choice and gone back and rewritten. But I had not read The Left Hand of Darkness. So I was partway through Ancillary Justice, the first draft, before I said, this is silly. I need to go read The Left Hand of Darkness. So, in fact, I didn't begin with that as a model, but I did read it partway through, and of course, it's so famous, there's no way I can say that it didn't influence what I was doing, because I was thinking about what her choices were when I was making my own choices. Yeah.
So we have time for a couple more questions if people, Now everyone puts their hand up.
Oh,
Come on.
I'm happy to indulge.
You good?
Yeah.
I'm getting exercise.
My question is kind of twofold. One is how many full-length books did you write before you felt like you had one that was publishable? And then how many did you try to get published before you were actually successful?
I actually tried to get that very first novel published. I sent it around a couple of places, and I am so fortunate that no one bid. I go back and look at it now, and I mean, my friends were like, yeah, this is really cool. And that was helpful, and there was some good stuff there. And I was sort of writing in the same universe around Ancillary Justice, but it is not a good novel. It's just not good. And I did send it a couple places, and it was rejected, and I put it aside, and I said, you know what, I'm going to write short stories for a while, because that's the traditional, you sell some short stories, and then you make a name for yourself, and then you sell a novel. But I did the next year, went back and wrote a sequel to that ill-fated first novel, the next NaNoWriMo. So 2 novels. Then I focused hard on the short fiction, and sold a fair amount of short fiction. And then I was like, yeah, I'm being a coward by not going to that story that I really wanted to write. So it's time for me to fish or cut bait about that. And that was when I sat down. I never showed anybody or tried to sell that second novel, the sequel to the first. It's terrible. The first novel, I went back and edited it. You don't write, you know about NaNoWriMo? Yeah, you try and write 50,000 words in a month. You do not get anything publishable out of that. I don't. There are people who write very quickly, and I had to go back and edit it. That second one is still just like a pile of garbage, right? Just sort of thrown out on, because the only way to win Nano is to never stop typing, right? You don't know where to go next? Where's your character? Standing in the kitchen? She needs breakfast. All right, time to fry some eggs. You just, that's how you get through NaNoWriMo, right? But it's not readable. So there's those 2 books. And then the third book, by then I had actually sold a fair amount of short fiction, and knew that if nothing else, I could sell some short fiction, so I must be able to do something. And I was like, I'm just going to make this as good as I can. And so it was the third book that I wrote, and I was not going to give up on it. And so that was how that worked. I know people who have literally a dozen books in their trunk. It can take a while, and that's okay, and that's actually normal. So it's also normal to feel like your first novel is that this is it, right? This is great. And it's normal to feel really heartbroken when nobody wants to bite on that first novel. Totally normal. But it's normal to keep going and end up with a whole bunch of books because you don't have novel writing lessons, right? Or maybe sometimes you do, but there are things you have to figure out for yourself. Yeah. Oh.
On the way, anyone? Anyone on the way? No? Okay.
Oh, there's
someone on the way.
Person, right there.
Where?
The person with the water bottle there.
Hi, thank you. This is too specific to really be a craft question, but I was curious, do you have a favorite anthropologist, any favorite research or anything that really stayed with you?
I don't necessarily have a favorite anthropologist. And as much as I love anthropology, anthropology can be a little bit hinky, right? With the way it approaches the people that they're studying. I mean, why do so often people go somewhere else to do anthropology, right? But anyway, sorry, that's a whole thing. Sometimes particular research will stick with me, and I don't do what I ought to do, is take very careful notes of what I'm reading, because later on I'm like, oh, I read that in this really fabulous book. It was a book. It was really good, right? There is, I will name, because this one I keep remembering, it was Religion in Roman Egypt, Assimilation and Resistance, by somebody whose last name was Frankfurter, which is probably why I remember the book. And it was really amazing book. Roman Egypt was not, when we think of Egypt, the time you're attracted to is really ancient, like, the first dynasty, or, people building the pyramids, which was a very, very long time ago. And we tend to think of, Roman Egypt as being, oh, it's kind of not as cool. Maybe it's, it's not as pure. What even does that mean, right? But it was really interesting. That book was interesting the way it talked about the way that we could look at how religion and religious practices was changing, right, depending on these very different cultures coming through. I recommend it if that's something, if you hear that title and go, that sounds really cool, it's really cool. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Be thinking, people. This is it. There we go. Thanks. So I'm very curious. I have a weird quirk, and I want to know if this happens to you too when you're writing. So often you're told, if you want to be a good writer, you got to read. And I find, though, that when I'm reading, when I then go try to transition to writing, I am also parroting whatever the style of writing. So
that's fine. That's okay.
Yeah, all of a sudden I'm like writing like Dickens or Shakespeare. It's like, wait a minute, that's not my voice. Do you have that? Yeah.
Just
okay.
be aware that happens. There's nothing wrong with that. Have you ever gone to the art museum, I don't know if you see this as much, and seen people sitting there painting paintings of the paintings? How many times can I get painting in that sentence? That's how they learn to paint, right? It's actually not a bad idea to try and write like somebody who you really admire. Not like, you don't want to, I'm going to write exactly like C.J. Cherryh for my entire career. Not like that. But like, how does she do what she's doing, right? There's nothing wrong with that, but be aware of it. And maybe if you're writing something with really sort of sharp, clear prose, like very clean with no extraneous, maybe don't read Dickens right before you're, right? Yeah. But if you want something with that very elevated diction, go and read some Dickens, read George Eliot, read Jane Austen, read that. There's nothing like that for getting you in, getting that in your ear. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And from a sensitivity standpoint, what was the first novel that made you cry?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, oh, certainly. And I'm trying to think. Shoot. I'm sure plenty did. I mean, you read when you're a little kid and somebody's dog dies. Yeah. But I don't know what the first one that made me cry was. Yeah. But plenty have. And sometimes those are like the best kind of, although, it is kind of embarrassing to be like on the bus and ugly crying. But yeah, that's the best. I actually had somebody come up to me at a convention and burst into tears trying to explain to me how hard they'd cried over a thing that happened in ancillary justice. And I was like, on the one hand, this is the best thing you could ever tell a writer. On the other hand, you're standing here crying. And I said, oh, and she said, when I read that, I hated you. And I said, I'm sorry, I wrote it on purpose to make you feel that way.
Here maybe
I'm more than happy to.
If people want to come up, if people want to bring books to get signed, and there's books outside, and this is the first of the Lindawood Craft Talks, so keep your eyes peeled. Anne is the, I think, the marvelous. Thank you. Thank
you. This has been lovely. Y'all had such good questions, and keep writing. It's normal to feel feel like you're not, it's normal to feel like you're not getting anywhere, and it's normal to feel like nobody understands you, and it's normal to feel like you're just not as good as you want to be. It's normal. We all feel that way. It just means you're a writer. So keep going, okay?